Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Bernard, and I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose. On behalf of the owners and of the staff, I'd like to welcome all of you to this evening's event. As you may already know, Politics and Prose hosts hundreds of in person events along with our partnered and supported events, trips, and classes. So please check our website for a full list. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask all of you to please turn off or silence your cell phones so as not to disrupt the event. And when we get to the Q&A portion, please line up at the microphone over here by the pillar before asking your questions. It is my honor to introduce all of you to Professor Juliet Bellow. Professor Bellow is Associate Professor of Art History at American University. She is the author of Modernism on Stage, the Ballet Russes, and the Parisian Avant-Garde, and served as a consulting scholar for the 2013 exhibition De Galive and the Ballet Russes, 1909 to 1929, at the National Gallery of Art here in Washington, D.C. Tonight, she will be talking about her new book, Rodin's Dancers. In this book, Professor Bellow traces Rodin's development as an artist and as a master of sculpture through his relationship with the Cambodian Royal Ballet. At the same time, it is also a book about the interrelation between two disciplines, sculpture and dance, and how this relationship is crucial in the elevation of both art forms. Professor Bellow will be in conversation with Mary Morton. Morton received her PhD in the history of art and architecture in 1998 from Brown University. She was a former associate curator of paintings at the J. Paul Getty Museum and associate curator of European art at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. She joined the curatorial staff of the National Gallery of Art in 2010, and she is currently curator and head of the Department of French Paintings at the NGA. Everyone, let us all welcome Professor Juliet Bellow and Mary Morton.
Hello, hello. Oh, this is on. Good, thank you. Good. Well, it's so great to be back at Politics and Prose with Juliet and talking about this absolutely beautiful book. And so I thought I would start with the great softball of Juliet. What's your book about? So we'll just start there, if that's okay.
Sure. So the book focuses on Rodin's late career from the 1890s through the 19-teens. And it's really about what dance meant to Rodin, dance as an idea and dance as a practice. It's about the centrality of dance to his processes of artistic making. And it's also about its centrality to his persona, his sort of public image. But it's not just about what dance meant to Rodin, it's also about what Rodin meant to dancers. So I'm interested in wondering and sort of thinking about why the dancers in his orbit were interested in associating themselves with the great master.
The great master. Yeah, so the book is so beautiful. Can you just show everybody
Yes.
the cover? I can hold your...
Yeah.
So beautiful. So everybody can see that Rodin, the R-O-D-I-N, is the first word and it's the biggest word.
Yes.
Because Rodin is a really big deal. He's kind of like, he's a cultural icon. I mean, I think that apart from maybe Michelangelo, he's the best known sculptor in the history of art. And of course, they used to call him the modern Michelangelo. I mean, it's Rodin. He's huge.
It's because he wanted them to.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, that's what we're going to hear about.
Yeah.
But I think we should start by just talking about him a little bit.
Sure.
And what you do with him.
Yeah, I mean, so I would say that his career is sort of the classic case of failing upwards. He was born in Paris in 1840. He tried and failed 3 times to get into the very prestigious École des Beaux-Arts in Paris to study statuary, but he never made it. And so instead he enrolled in what was called the Petite École. It was for industrial designers. So he learned how to make furniture and vases and architectural decorations and what my grandmother would call tchotchkes. And that was what he did for the first maybe 10 or 15 years of his career. But basically through sheer force of will and determination, he became a maker of monumental sculptures. And the sort of traditional story about his career is that he does it because, of course, he is so talented, right? But he's also, I think in my telling, a kind of an opportunist, a careerist, somebody who was driven to find out how to become successful and who was largely responsible for creating his own celebrity. So that's really what the book is about in terms of him.
Okay. Yeah, his manipulation of media
Right.
and the market.
Right,
In a really kind of genius way.
He was great he really understood the sort of modern media age. He subscribed to what was called a clippings service. It basically was like having a Google alert for your name. Anytime a newspaper would mention you, even in newspapers in languages that he himself didn't read, and his secretaries would have to translate, this is what this English newspaper is saying about you. So yeah, he really kept tabs on what people were saying about him. He would, if a critic said something that he really liked, he would, seek out that person and say, hey, would you like to come for a visit to my studio? And then he would sort of just feed them all the information that he wanted them to know about himself. So he was very good at creating a certain narrative about himself.
And he was also a modernist sculptor. Which is kind of a big deal because, of course, modernism we often think of in two dimensions. It's kind of a painting thing, right? Impressionism and post-impressionism and neo-impressionism and abstract expressionism. And how do you have a modern, how do you do that to sculpture? How do you do that in three dimensions? But he supposedly did.
Right. I mean, in 1846, very famously, the critic Charles Baudelaire wrote an article, Why Sculpture is Boring. And I mean, the answer is, or for Baudelaire, it's too tied to the classical tradition. And it can't, it's very hard to innovate as a sculptor. The materials are very expensive, for one thing. So between sort of the inherent properties of the art form and the sort of expense of it, it was very difficult for sculptors to figure out how to become modern and modernist. But dance was really, in my telling, very key to that. Rodin's not the only sculptor who was interested in dance. We know Degas was interested, other sculptors who are not sort of household names these days of his era, but he had the most sort of thorough and searching, I think, relationship with dance, and was the most sort of interested, I think, in the lived experiences of the dancers that he was interested in.
Because it is certainly in the late 19th century sculpture still very figural. It's tied to the human figure, often the naked human figure, which has classical groundings and antecedents. Whereas painting, of course, is rushing away from the figure in the late 19th century.
Right. I mean, sculpture in that period, there is no abstract version of sculpture. It is, by definition, a sculpture of a body. And so your encounter with it is an encounter with something that is very much like another person, and yet it's also strangely unlike another person. And I think that's part of why Rodin felt that dance could be a kind of partner to him in thinking about how sculpture could become modern. It's a modern subject matter. I mean, dancers are in the 1890s celebrities, so it gives a certain kind of spectacular appeal to his work, but it also allows him to bring in things like movement, things like dynamism, incorporating different kinds of points of view. All the things that Baudelaire hated about sculpture are the things that Rodin enhances to make it so exciting.
Mm-hmm. And the physicality.
Yeah.
And what Rodin does with like a tactility, inspiring a kind of tactile visual response. You want to touch his sculptures. And in fact, I went to college at Stanford, where the great Rodin scholar Albert Elson taught. And I took a seminar with him. And because we were with Albert Elson, he encouraged us to touch the Rodin sculptures, the bronzes, to feel the surfaces, to touch them. And we were like, really? And we did? But Dr. Elson was there. But there was, because this is what's so fun. I mean, paintings, forget about it. I mean, nobody's touching paintings. There's really nothing there. But you want to, and you talk, and we'll get to that hopefully at the end, there is a sculpture that you think was made for holding, given its scale.
I mean, Rodin, I think, it made, particularly in this period of his career, a lot of sculptures that were made to be held in the hand. I mean, sculpture awakens kinesthetic and proprioceptive responses, right? We feel, we can understand our spatial and kinesthetic relationship to it in ways that I think paintings, they don't awaken quite the same kinds of sensory experiences.
Yeah. How many people here are sculpture people versus painting people? Do we like paintings better than sculptures, or sculpture? How many people are sculpture people? Oh, wow.
Come
This
on,
is
guys.
great. I'm so glad we're doing this talk.
Now you are.
All right, forget the paintings. I'm just going to assume that everybody loves paintings. How many people are primarily interested in dance? Oh,
Yay.
Interesting. This is so good. Okay, the book is about a sculptor,
Right.
but it is also about
Yes,
dance. Can
yeah,
you
yeah.
plunge into that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I think the most important thing that's maybe not well understood now is that dance wasn't really considered among Parisian audiences at that time anyway, to be a fine art form. It was considered to be sort of light entertainment. And so the dancers that I talk about in this book, including Loïe Fuller, who's one of the sort of early pioneers of modern dance, the Cambodian Royal Ballet, and Vaslav Nijinsky, the star dancer and choreographer for the Ballet Russe, are all in their different ways engaged in trying to rethink the status of dance and to give it a kind of legitimacy and gravitas in a way that it didn't have in this period. And that, for me, is why a lot of these dancers are interested in Rodin. He and sculpture as a medium have a kind of artistic legitimacy and kind of credibility that they hope to accrue themselves. And so to be known as one of Rodin's dancers, as one of the dancers that he calls an artist, right, is really important to them establishing dance as a fine art. So it's really about not just the sort of microcosm of the interactions between Rodin and the dancers that he knew, but also about the sort of trajectories of sculpture and dance at this pivotal moment for both of those art forms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because like classical ballet in the 19th century, it had a kind of moment in the sun, maybe in the 30s and 40s, and then it really did become just sort of like trot the girls out there, have them jump around for the opera.
Right. Yeah.
But there was no innovation or creativity. It was really
I
don't know anything.
Right. Well, I think part of it is when it becomes commercialized. Okay. That then you need to get people to come, right? And one of the best ways is to have women on stage in clothing that when you put the gas lights on it, it vanishes and you can see their legs. But also, one of the main places where you would see ballet in Paris in the late 19th century was in music halls. Mm-hmm. So it really is mostly associated with sort of commercialized entertainment and sort of what would be considered vulgar, quote unquote, right, as opposed to more sort of elevated.
Okay, that's so interesting. Okay, good. Thank you for that clarification. Can we talk a little bit about genius?
Sure.
A little bit, because you talked a little bit about it already. I mean, Rodin is supposed to be this sort of like almost divinely anointed greatest genius of all time kind of a thing. I mean, the real discourse of genius that he owns and manipulates, and that is still sort of coursing through the literature, which is why it's so terrifying to decide that you're going to write a book about Rodin, the great genius. I mean, the literature is sort of extraordinary.
Right.
But what is genius? What is genius all about?
I mean, I think that, I don't know if I can answer that question, but I certainly can say he was very invested in being perceived as a genius. As I was saying. And when I was reading, so because he subscribed to a clipping service and then saved every single article that mentioned him, they're still there at the Musée Rodin in Paris, and that's what I was looking at. And the more I read it, the more I started to see that all of the sort of stories about him that were written in that period all say the same thing. And I started the light bulb came on at a certain point, and I realized, oh, it's him. He's the one who's telling all of them, this is the narrative of me, of my career. I was misunderstood because I'm so great. And then only after time did people begin to see, what a great genius I am. So he is really the starting point for this. He's also responsible for, and this is something that I talk about, particularly in the third chapter of the book, the creation of the museum itself. He really wanted to have a museum devoted to himself in the center of Paris, which was so unusual in that time period. Nobody, no single artist would have a museum dedicated to themselves. And the fact that he succeeded, and that now the museum is this sort of shrine to his great genius, is part of why the dancers that I want to talk about often are sort of overshadowed. None of them have an institution like that to preserve and perpetuate their own legacy. Mm-hmm. And most of the literature that you talked about is published by the Musée Rodin.
Oh, that's right.
So,
Okay.
so they're very invested in this idea of him.
Yeah, and you see what happened. We were going to switch tracks and start talking about the dancers, and then all of a sudden we were back talking about him again.
I know,
It's
exactly.
the
That's
kind
what
of,
happens with him.
force that he has.
Yeah, in fact, I called it in the book the Rodin cul-de-sac,
Yeah.
because every time I thought I was going down a road where I was going to be writing about the dancers, right, and finding some way to give them agency and power, and then suddenly I was realizing that I was back to him again. And so, yeah, I just started to feel like I couldn't. It was a trap that he had set for me and everyone else.
He's still still pulling the levers. All right, we're going to try again.
Yeah.
There are 3 case studies that you raise, and I just found each of them to be super interesting and discrete, very distinct one from another,
Yes, right.
and involving a very different set of issues,
Right.
but really compelling. So I definitely want to get through at least sketches of the 3.
Let's do it. Okay,
case studies.
great.
Okay,
yeah,
first one.
so first one, right. So my first chapter begins just after 1898, when I will talk about Rodin, when his Balzac sculpture is first shown publicly, and he's totally humiliated because everybody thinks it's atrocious. And I think it's at that moment that he realizes that he needs to turn his reputation around. It's also at that time that he meets Loie Fuller. And she is a fascinating character, very much a sort of self-made artist and celebrity. And it's clear from the correspondence between them that she is desperate to have Rodin make a statue of her.
She's American. Is
Yes,
that true?
right.
She
She's
comes
American-born.
from, where does she come from?
San Francisco, I think.
San Francisco.
Yeah.
Amazing.
I know.
No? Where is she from? Oh, the Midwest. And
Okay,
then maybe
right.
maybe she goes out as a young person. In any case, American.
Yes,
which is kind of
thank you.
fascinating to think of her on the scene in Paris.
Right. Right, so she is determined, she is by then, 1892 is her debut in Paris. She becomes a massive celebrity. But as I said, I think that she really wants the sort of credibility. She wants to be known both as a great, commercial success, but also to have the sort of critical acclaim. And so Rodin is really important to that. So she's desperate to have him make a sculpture for her. Her plan is to show it in her pavilion to herself at the 1900 Exposition Universelle, or Universal Exhibition in Paris. And there is no written record of Rodin ever responding to her request, but he never made that sculpture. So the chapter is really about her desire to have him make that sculpture, but also why he wouldn't want to. Because by 1900, there's a sort of cottage industry of making little, knick-knack sort of sculptural versions of her. It's exactly the kind of thing that he was trained to do, and exactly what he does not want to be associated with. So, and I think also, the idea of making a sculpture of her to be shown in her pavilion, it's like that would make him subservient to her, and he's not interested in being that. So what he decided to do instead is make his own exhibition, just a block away.
At the same time,
At the same time, yes, simultaneously. He invited all the critics who had written about her to come and write about him, and to give lectures about him in his exhibition. And my chapter is also about the way that he curated his sculptures. And so he was very attentive to the sort of effects of light and spacing and placement. And I think that he's trying to sort of encourage viewers to see a kind of movement, a kind of Fulleresque movement in his sculptures.
And it's revolutionary in terms of exhibiting sculpture, what he does.
Oh, yeah. Very, the way that sculptures were usually...
pedestals and...
Right. He was very interested in all that. Yeah, he had specially made pedestals for all his work. He was very concerned about the lighting conditions. Famously at the annual Paris Salon, the sculptures just looked horrible. They were usually in the sort of basement kind of crypt. Again, I mean, it's the sort of painting always wins. And so he was determined to have a kind of, exhibition scenography that really suited the way his sculptures should look. So he was really, he did the whole show. He figured out how to get somebody to fund it. He planned it all himself. He did all the, publicity for it. I mean, he was a real entrepreneur.
I think it would have been really hard to make a sculpture, an effective sculpture of Loie Fuller. But,
exactly.
I mean, the tchotchkes, but it would have been interesting to see what he did.
Right.
The your next case study, he does.
Yeah. So a few years later, in 1906, the Cambodian Royal Ballet came to France for the first time ever, and to be presented at a colonial exhibition in Marseille. And the colonial ministry of France actually invited Rodin to come down and see the dancers and have modeling sessions with them, because I think they sort of wanted like a celebrity endorsement of this exhibition. And so he goes to Marseille and he has, I think, 4 days of sketching with these dancers, whose names remain, but very little else that we know about them. So they were harder to write about in many ways than Loie Fuller, who left a whole record of sort of her own, and I really had a clear sense of sort of what her agenda was. And it was harder for me with the Cambodian Royal Ballet. However, what is kind of interesting about that chapter, so Rodin makes all of these, he makes something like 150 drawings of the Cambodian Royal Ballet, and he has many of his drawings published in mass media newspapers, along with interviews in which he talks about sort of what he thinks about Cambodian dance. And the style of the drawings is very
amazing.
Sort of gestural.
They're so beautiful. There's a lot of really gorgeous color
This is not one of the Cambodian Royal Ballet dancers, but
we think that's Loie?
Well, I sort of make the claim that this is Loie. Yeah.
But they're beautiful. They're really beautiful.
Right. And so there's a kind of physicality to, you can see in the drawings that he's using his whole arm, right? Rather than, drawing with your wrist versus drawing with your whole arm. There's a kind of dancer-like quality to the way he draws, and I think he's trying to make a kind of implicit parallel, right, between their style of dance and his style of drawing. So again, he's sort of using them in his own, for his own purposes to be seen in a certain kind of way.
And he comes back in with color.
He's
looking, and he's not looking at his page.
Well, he says that he's not looking at his page, but actually there are photographs where he's clearly looking at his page. Everything that he says about himself we should be skeptical about. But he also says that he makes them in one go, right? Yeah, I know, because this dancer is like teetering out of control, right? He says that he makes them blind. He says that he makes them all in one go, but then when you look at them, you can see there's a base layer of drawing, then there's gouache or watercolor, then there's pen over that. Like, you cannot, you need time for all those things to dry. So he's totally BSing. But for whatever reason, people say it over and over again, and then it takes on a kind of truth value.
They are very lively.
Exactly
about motion and what he's seeing and what he's feeling and what they're doing, and you can just imagine how mesmerized he would have been by these foreign dancers and the way that their physical vocabulary would be completely different from anything he's ever seen before.
Right.
And he's trying to work with them, as you describe, in a very sensitive way. The way he's trying to get these models to respond. He has relationships with the models.
He does, yeah. So, I think he perceived their dance as looking very sculptural, in part because the kind of movement idiom is very different from ballet, which would be the main form that he would know, and also Loie Fuller. Loie Fuller is about kind of continuous motion. Ballet would be about leg work, and Cambodian dance is a very different kind of style, and it appeared to him and other French observers as very slow and almost, still looking, right? Yeah. And so I think he saw a kind of sculptural quality to it. It turns out, it took me quite a long time to just find a list of the names of the 42 young women who came to France in 1906, but there's very little else that we know about them. But what we do know, in one of the interviews in which he goes on and on about how much he loves Cambodian dance, they name a couple of dancers that were supposedly his favorite dancers, and I found this very obscure article that talks about how when they got back on the boat to go back to Cambodia, he had left a pair of shoes for one of them and said, for little Sap, who knows how to sing the Marseillaise. I guess that was one of the talents that she picked up while she was in France.
She had learned some French.
She had learned some French. So, I think that the process of making these drawings was very collaborative, and I think I try to look at the drawings to try to reimagine what the dancers might have been doing, what kind of training they might have had. I think all of that information actually is in the drawings if you look at them carefully enough and try to see. And so I think there were at least two different dancers who specialized in two different kinds of roles within the Cambodian technique. You can see the one that you love is the sort of looks like a kind of giant dancer or supernatural dancer. So, I think we can know a certain amount about the dancers actually, ironically, through his drawings.
All of these drawings are in the Rodin Museum.
Almost all of them, yeah.
So you went and you just sat with them, and you went back and saw them probably several visits and really steeped in them. And I love the idea of using them to inform you about the dances themselves. I think you're sort of demystifying and deconstructing Rodin a little bit, but you're also giving him a lot you're giving him a lot. What he brings to us.
Right. I think that I do think he was a very sensitive dance viewer. I think he perceived a lot about what these dancers were doing, and I think what I am interested in with the drawings is the way that the dancer would have made a certain move, and that would have then inspired Rodin to make a move, right? That there's a kind of back and forth action between them, and then that allows me, even in the absence of having very much concrete information about these dancers, to sort of speculate, I guess, about what they may have done in order to produce the image that we have.
Those were some of my favorite parts, I have to say, of the book. Is of course your speculation when you go winging out there, but with real expertise and having studied dance, understanding dance. Allowing dance to teach you about art history and vice versa.
I think that what I certainly had to go outside of my own comfort zone as an art historian, because we have certain methodological tools that we use to interpret artworks. But the problem is that many of those tools don't allow me to get into what the dancers might have been doing, and that's when I would get into the Rodin cul-de-sac. So I often would borrow tools and ideas from dance studies like speculation in order to allow me to say something different about these drawings, so that it's not just about what Rodin saw or what he, how he perceived it.
Super interesting. I love that. All right, we want to save a little bit of time for the sexy chapter.
Oh, yes.
Nijinsky, who,
yes.
Again, like Rodin, he's just, so famous, obviously, in the dance world. And we had, with Loie Fuller, you sort of deal a little bit with sort of feminist politics, and then, of course, you do get into the colonial politics of what Rodin was doing with the Cambodian dancers,
right.
And then with Nijinsky, of course, it's Russia and cultural politics. But then there's just Nijinsky,
right.
And Rodin's engagement with him.
Yeah,
beautiful
yeah.
photographs
I don't want to
dances.
give anything away, but it is rather racy.
Yeah.
Right. So in 1912, so again, we're sort of skipping ahead 6 years. Nijinsky at the time is the star dancer for the Ballet Russe, which has become phenomenally popular in Paris at this time. And he's going to make his choreographic debut with the Ballet Afternoon of a Faun, which he suspects and knows is going to be very controversial because, of course, it is very erotic and ends with the simulation of a masturbatory act. And he and Diaghilev, the leader of the Ballet Russe, realize that they need to make sure to sort of pave the way for this ballet. And so they seek out Rodin, among others, to write a sort of positive criticism about the ballet in advance of its premiere. to make sure to sort of influence the public. So Rodin agrees. It goes on the front page of the daily newspaper, and it's a massive scandal.
On the day of the premiere.
On the day after the premiere.
Okay.
So we
Because,
know that it was already written because it, came out.
The ballet itself, I mean, it's one of the most scandalous performances.
Right.
Like,
yes.
in dance history.
Yes,
I mean, again,
indeed.
I don't know
Yeah,
dance history,
right.
but it's
10 minutes of very sexy dancing.
It's really wild, and it really pushes people.
Right, and so then Rodin himself gets sort of wrapped into this scandal. The chapter covers, this is where I'm talking about the Musée Rodin and the fact that at the time, Rodin was one of his main studios in Paris, and the building that he was trying to make into a museum for himself, and that became eventually a museum for himself, was a former convent. And this was a period in which there was a lot of sort of strife between the sort of Republican left and their sort of secular ideals and then the Catholic right. And so he became a kind of political football, he and Nijinsky, where they were attacked for, being obscene, essentially, in particularly Rodin in this former convent where young virgins once roamed freely, as one newspaper put it. And this is the one example in which Rodin actually makes a sculpture of a specific dancer. The sculpture itself is only about this big. It's very, very small, like 7 inches or 8 inches tall. And so it is like a lot of the sculptures that he made in his late career. I think it was designed to be held in the hand. And the importance of that, of course, is that it then has no fixed orientation. It can be moved around, right? And so in many ways, one of the defining aspects of sculpture is its stillness. And of course, for those of you who know Afternoon of a Faun, one of the things that I think allowed Rodin to see it as a sculpture is that there's a lot of stillness in it. Nijinsky, at the beginning of the ballet, sits still for a kind of excruciatingly long period of time. And so I think that the intimacy and tactility of one's experience of the sculpture is really a parallel to the kind of the eroticism of the ballet. But the other thing that I discovered in researching this sculpture, I was trying to figure out how Rodin had made it. Because when I looked at it, I kept sort of not understanding what the pose was. It kind of looks like Afternoon of a Faun, and it kind of doesn't, and I couldn't figure it out. And so I asked the Musée Rodin if they would let me go and look in their storerooms, which was kind of amazing. It's a very strange looking sculpture, yeah.
And you have three angles on this double spread, and of course you would want to have 100
yeah,
angles.
Exactly.
And I love the way you write it. You do a really nice description of what it would have been like to turn it in all of these, and it's almost like the whole ballet contained in this one three-dimensional object.
Right. Well, what happened was after many years of studying this sculpture, I finally got somebody at the Metropolitan Museum of Art to actually take it out of the vitrine because it's behind glass, and so you can only see it usually from one angle.
Is there only one cast?
There are a few different casts of it. Actually, the Met right now owns 2.
Okay.
And so that's what happened. So they took both of them out. This is when I realized that it was meant to be held by hand because each of the casts is mounted slightly differently relative to the base. So in one of them, he's kind of leaning back, and the other one, he's kind of moving forward. And you can't really notice that if you only look at one, but when I saw them side by side, I thought, oh, okay. This is different, and that made me realize that he didn't ever probably fix it on a base. This is all stuff that people in museums have done after his death. So what I realized is that if you sort of move it around and turn it all the way around, it plays the ballet from beginning to end. So what they did was, I have a video. If I could have put it in the book, I would have. But they turned it very, very, very slowly.
On a pedestal?
They put it in a book, and then they just turned it around. It was very, But okay. I mean, then when I saw it, I mean, even what's amazing was the moment when I really realized was that if you turn it a certain way, his hands look like they're going, like they disappear under his, basically, he's playing around down there.
Yeah.
And but of course, what's interesting in terms of all of the sort of gendered and sexual sort of dynamics that you're talking about is, of course, that then it becomes this sort of homoerotic encounter between Rodin and Nijinsky. And of course, I also found some amazing diary entries by the man who had been the go-between between them and who brought Nijinsky to Rodin's studio. And my favorite part was, he says, Nijinsky enters and he takes Rodin's hand and he kisses it, and Rodin blushed.
Ooh, lovely.
And I thought, okay,
Yeah.
now
Who would
I know
not?
what to say.
Who would not blush? It was,
but-
yeah, really beautiful.
But then
according to the photograph.
what I ultimately figured out by going to the Musée Rodin and looking in their storeroom, so this curator, I said, well, I think that maybe Rodin made this sculpture out of pre-existing body parts that he had in his studio. And she said, well, okay. And she pulls out this drawer and there's like 100 body parts. Rodin called them his giblets. And we just sort of kept like hunting and picking, and we found all the body parts, including, it turns out that the torso of Nijinsky is actually a reduced copy of Rodin's Adam. So he took like
Wow,
his
that's
signature
beautiful.
work and
Yeah.
he made it.
Yeah.
He made it Nijinsky, and so
Amazing,
there's this sort of
amazing.
crossing of their two signature styles in the sculpture.
And in the pantheon of Rodin's oeuvre, do you think the Nijinsky sculpture is particularly powerful and successful, or it's just fascinating because it's connected to the dancer, or?
Yeah, I don't. That's
it's
a really
hard.
interesting question. I mean,
Yeah,
I guess it
'cause it's
depends on
small.
what makes something important.
Yeah.
You know, I think conceptually for me, why it's important is that it made me realize that he fundamentally understood something about Nijinsky's craft that that he saw as parallel to his own,
And was able to translate that
and was
into
able
medium.
to sort of
that's
exactly,
pretty successful.
and that basically he saw his work as kind of choreographic in that sense. So-
Beautiful. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful third chapter. A couple of minutes can we just spend on your final chapter?
yeah.
You bring it up to the last decade. Can you
Yeah,
talk about what you did there? It's a conclusion, basically.
Right, yes. I knew from the beginning that I wanted to write in the conclusion about recent dance works that are about Rodin. I mean, there's like 3 or 4 of them, and I find it very odd that people still want to make dances that are about Rodin, and I couldn't figure out what should I say about that. Like, there's obviously something important about that. And I actually finished a whole draft, and I wrote a version of it that I hated and I knew was bad. And then I happened to meet a dancer who had been in one of this ballet called Rodin Claudel, about the 2 sculptors, done by the Grand Ballet Canadien, based in Montreal. And then I realized, like, oh, right. The obvious thing is that I should talk to these dancers, right?
Yeah.
For those of us who study historical art,
They're all
the idea
dead.
of interviewing somebody is like not in our toolkit. So I started talking to the dancers and ultimately the choreographer of that work, and then a couple of others, and it was really fascinating. I mean, one thing that's clear is that the reason that these choreographers are interested in Rodin is because he's really box office gold.
Right.
I mean.
Yeah.
In fact, I
think
was
he's
just told there's
somewhere
going to be a
in here.
ballet about Degas. So, yeah, I know. But so I think that, if you have a ballet that's about a known figure, that's going to bring people in. And I think that also there's a way in which, even in the 21st century, that the name Rodin has this connection to genius, to creativity, to art making, all the things that choreographers, I think, still want to be associated with. So that, I think, was a real revelation and important to me. But the other thing that I learned, I actually had to go back and rewrite the introduction because I was talking to one of the dancers, the one who played Camille Claudel, and she was telling me that they incorporated a lot of Rodin poses into the choreography. And so I said, well, what does it feel like to dance a Rodin? And she said, puts a lot of strain on your torso, and also on your neck. You have to be like very flexible, and the legs are unimportant. And I thought, that is so brilliant. I understood Rodin in a different way and so for me, it's really about crediting the embodied knowledge of people who can experience those sculptures from the inside. So it really, that was what sort of helped me to think about different ways of bringing in the agency of the dancers as a kind of counterweight to his great genius.
I love it. It's beautiful. And I would love to spend more time picking apart him and genius, the idea of genius, because there is a lot more to say about that. But I think we should maybe take a couple of questions if you're up for it.
Let's do it.
Do we have some questions for Juliet about this amazing topic?
So once again, we learned that genius
Yes.
is not necessarily a very nice person.
Yeah. Fair enough.
So did Rodin have much contact or any contact with Degas and Toulouse-Lautrec? Because they're all more or less contemporaries?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he and Degas are exact contemporaries. Not so much with them. He was in the circle of sort of symbolist artists who used to hang out at the Café Voltaire on Monday nights. They were kind of a different group. But I mean, he was professionally connected with them. He exhibited with Monet. His first big sort of almost solo exhibition in Paris was a joint exhibition with Claude Monet. So they were friends or friendly professional sort of associates. But his main sort of art world friend was a guy named Eugène Carrière. And he sort of, so he was in a slightly different sort of group, but he knew all of them.
And I was a little bit late, but the famous sculpture that you didn't mention, the thinker?
Yes.
Yes. I mean, Rodin is very famous, but in this country, maybe as much for the thinker as for the dancers.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean...
And how did they intersect?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that, so Rodin's sort of main period in which he's making monumental sculptures, including the thinker, is, from about 1880 to about 1900. He has such a hard time with his monumental sculptures. Usually those are commissioned by governmental bodies or somebody who has the scratch to, give him the funds to work on. I mean, because a monumental sculpture takes years and years to make. So, you need to have a lot of payment for that. So he kind of abandons that. But so essentially because of the replicability of sculpture, the way in which we have, he could make multiple casts of all of his famous works. And so that's why we have so many thinkers all over America, because, he could kind of churn them out. So, that was one of his ways actually of figuring out how to fund his practice was to, to find somebody who was willing to buy an edition or a copy of one of his monumental sculptures. So, I mean, I think that those monumental works, they certainly come in my first chapter, which is really about the way that he curates this retrospective, really, of his career up to 1900. But for the most part, it's often as much about his ideas about sculpture and about being a sculptor as it is about those famous works. So it is a kind of different side or different perspective on his career.
Thank you. And there's a pretty good collection down at the National Gallery of Art of Rodin sculpture. So if this is whetting your appetite for seeing the thing, you can't touch them, but you can see them in the person. It was Mrs. Simpson bought a lot. Kate Simpson. Right. We've got some really good things down there. Yeah,
there is one really bad one, which is one of the. So the thing about sculpture is that what a lot of sculptors would do is to make additions, small scale versions of their famous sculptures, and one of them that he was very reticent to do that. He did not want to abdicate control of the making of his sculptures very often, but the one that he did because he really kind of thought it was a bad sculpture was the Kiss. Yeah. And so the National Gallery has one of these kisses, and it's really quite bad.
Kitsch.
It's about
you just
this
gotta
big.
Say it.
Yeah,
it's
very
kitschy.
kitschy. I mean, because he really, it's like Rodin, like fourth hand. I mean, he has so little involvement in the making of it,
and it does harm. I mean, I think he gets a bad rap from a lot of people. There are a lot of people who are really like totally turned off by
Sure.
Rodin because he's everywhere and because they are subjected to these horrible, not quality controlled casts
right, the
that
bad
just look
versions.
like
Right.
they just have no patina and they're all
Tragedies.
soft and
Right.
it's just
Well,
sad.
and I mean, one thing to know about the sculptures is that, the marble carvings, he didn't have any physical sort of, take part in the making of the marble. Somebody else would carve it for him. So he would make the clay, and then his assistants would make a plaster. And that usually preserves a certain amount of the touch of the artist because you can really see the fingerprints and all the very nuanced details. Then from there, you would either make a bronze cast, which I think generally speaking is closer to that plaster, or he would send it to a master carver who would carve it for him. And he chose those carvers very carefully, as with the founders, but he wasn't involved in the actual physical production of the marble.
Good.
So if he was interested in motion,
Yeah.
did he, I mean, the one other thing besides bodies that people used to sculpt
Yes.
were horses.
Horses. Nope. No horses.
No
with
horses.
Rodin. No, only bodies.
Because there's motion there too, and
Mm-hmm.
there a lot of thought was given by some sculptors, not so much to the guy on, it was always the guy on the horse,
Right.
as it was to the horse,
Yeah. Yeah.
as you would know as a art historian.
Right. Yeah. No, none of those.
No.
Anybody else?
Any other questions, comments?
Molly.
Yes, good. Come on up.
I have a question for the non-art historians among us. So we've heard a lot about Rodin's creation of this idea of genius. But can you tell us what was modern about his sculpture and what did set it apart? And maybe aside from the narrative.
Yeah. I think the main thing that I would say is moving away from the sense that the sculpture had to be idealized, right? So in the classical tradition, the human body would be idealized and made beautiful, and so he often put the body under stress, and both sort of, he would depict sort of psychologically resonant and fraught poses. So you would really, like The Thinker, where you're sort of invested not just in the beauty of the body, but thinking about what's going on inside the mind of the person. And that often put the body into extreme stress positions. So he would, as part of that, instead of being sort of balanced and stable sculptures, he often threw the body out of alignment or off plumb. So it would be kind of physically unbalanced, and it would have to be sort of cantilevered in very complicated ways, right? So sort of throwing the body off of its alignment. And then abstraction, I think. So playing around with the surface textures and making the surface textures, instead of very smooth and kind of finished, making them rough, so that, especially if you're looking at one of the bronzes, they refract light. I think that's why, for Loïe Fuller, whose dance was all about, she had up to 100 stagehands shining different colored lights on her as she danced. And so the idea that he was using then sort of light effects to create a certain kind of atmospheric quality around his sculptures, I think was sort of Fuller-esque. And then the part body. So in his later career, he didn't necessarily feel like he had to depict a full and complete figure, but he might, he would recycle his own sculptures, because of course, since you can replicate them ad infinitum, he could just make more and more and more. And so then he would make one, and then he would, maybe well, let's just take off the head. And maybe the arms too, and then let's see what that looks like. So he was really the first ever sculptor to make sculptures that didn't necessarily depict a complete body.
Fragments, yeah.
Yeah, fragments,
Really
right? So he one of the
hands
things that he famously did was, just sculptures of hands. And that's how I figured out about the Nijinsky, because there would be stories about people visiting his studio, and they would say, he would pick up his hand and sort of turn it around, and then he'd give it to you and let you turn it around, and so I realized that the sort of unfixedness of those sculptures was part of the intended viewing experience. So it was a sort of mobile mobile. So hopefully that's
Yeah.
a kind of,
And I think,
basic.
also the relationship with the market and the press is
Yeah,
a modern
yeah,
thing,
right.
which is why I
For
love,
sure.
as a paintings person, his coupling with Monet.
Right.
What year is that again?
1889.
1889, the two of them, because
Yeah.
of course Monet is on his way to becoming a French national treasure by manipulating the market and the press. And there's something very modern about that kind
Oh,
of
yeah.
broad dissemination, and but it goes against, I think, the ideal of the genius, and I do want to, because it's Rodin.
Yeah.
It's genius is a problematic concept.
Right.
We know this because we study this every day.
Right.
But I think for people that don't study art history deal with it every day, why is it problematic? What does it do for us, and what doesn't it?
Right.
What does it
Well,
detract
from
the story of like what really happened?
Right. I mean, first of all, I think maybe this is stating the obvious, but it's a very highly gendered and racialized concept.
I think it's obvious for us. But I think that
Right.
with Rodin,
Yeah.
I think it's really important to.
Yeah. I mean, I
it
think,
doesn't-
he's
It's not helpful for feminist art history.
right.
the
Yeah. I mean,
concept of
he's
genius.
capitalizing on his privilege for sure. But I mean, I think interestingly, also the dancers are right. I mean, why do they want to touch the money? Why do they want to be associated with Rodin? Well, it's because of the the kind of values of genius that he has. So they're all living in a system in which that has value
Yeah,
and status.
But it's made up.
oh, it's fully
It
made
doesn't.
up.
It's
But
not real
right.
genius.
Yeah.
It's a construct, and it is exclusionary, and
Right.
it is
Yeah. Right.
gender
right.
exclusive, and it is racially exclusive, and it is.
Well, I mean, the
there's so many
monograph.
things that are don't
Yeah.
have genius, so they
Right.
can't come in. But
the form of the art historical monograph, the
Yeah.
book about the single artist, that tells you everything, right? I mean, it's who gets the book about themselves, right? And this was the thing that I kept fighting with my press about, was does Rodin's name have to be the biggest one on the book? And we really went back and forth about that many, many, many times. In the end, I felt okay about it because I felt like it was actually true to the dynamic where he is the grand maître, he's the great man. They all called him that. But it does mean that everybody else are just ancillary characters in
that's
his
the biggest
world,
problem, I think.
and
it's
so
just not how art is made. It's not made alone by some
Right.
singular
Right.
male genius. It's
Right.
It's collaborative.
Right.
And
I mean,
that's what this book is about.
Yeah, so he's packaging and producing it. I mean, if you look at the poster for his 1900 exhibition made by his friend Eugène Carrière, where it's showing Rodin sculpting and light is hitting his
It's a beautiful
brow,
photograph.
and he's like, it's like this mystical experience, right? And that is not how he worked, but that the poster sells that idea,
Because that idea sells.
Yeah. I mean, but yeah, so the whole question of should this book be called Rodin's Dancers, I was really profoundly troubled by the implications of that. But then, it's like at the National Gallery of Art, I'm sure that there's a lot of pressure to have a name in the exhibition title, right?
Sure. Oh yeah, the I word, absolutely.
So,
but no, I love it. I mean, I love this sort of force, this centrifugal force at the heart of the book, and
Right.
then you've got these amazing case studies, basically.
Right. I was
And
trying to
they weave
write.
together, but they're quite separate, and it's
Right.
totally fascinating.
I sort of conceptualized it both as a monograph because he is the central character, but also a kind of anti-monograph, because I wanted to try to undo the kind of hagiography that a monograph is supposed to do. And so I thought of it as the dancers and Rodin sort of dancing around each other. And sort of each of them comes in and out of focus at various different times. And for me, that was a way to acknowledge his power and the power. Also, the power, in some ways, it's not even just him. It's like this name, Rodin. What does it stand for, right? It comes to stand for this whole series of values that we attach to artists. And Rodin himself is he's chasing that idea as much as the dancers are. So when I realized that, because of a very smart person who read my book and sort of helped me to see that, I started to, that was when it clicked for me about what that idea is and how powerful it is.
How long have you been working on this book?
I mean, I'm afraid to say.
I think it's important for people to know.
Like 12 years. Yeah, a really, really, really long time.
That's beautiful.
Well, in some ways even more, because I started writing about the Nijinsky sculpture in my dissertation.
Wow.
And then I realized when I finished my dissertation that the sculpture was the beginning of a whole different book, and that this is that book.
I love that.
So,
I love the way that you have allowed yourself to be pulled by things
and
that
also
not entirely in your control.
Right, exactly. I mean, I would say, it's interesting. I've written a book that's about a lot of artists and one that is about just one, and both have their pleasures and their challenges. And I would say the difficulty about writing a book in which one museum owns the keys to the entire castle is pretty hard. So
You got to be really nice.
I
You
mean,
got to bring chocolates.
I know. I only figured that out at the end.
Gifts, always.
And when I did that, and I thought, that I should have done that 8 years ago. They feel that they own this man.
Mm-hmm.
They
Everything
don't really
depends
want to
upon
share any of the materials. I mean, it took me years and years just to look at some of those drawings and some of the photographs. I mean, they do not want to share Rodin.
Yep.
So that was difficult.
Which is counter to what they really should be doing, of course, which is get people in here. They have a newish director who seems much more open.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll talk about that another time.
No, I mean, it is true that the old guard was less generous, I'll say, and that the younger crowd is nicer, and that they find, and also I just kept going back.
Yeah.
There's something about, for any of you who've worked in a French archive, their immediate response is no, like it could never happen. And then the next time you go back, they're like, probably not. And then you go back again, they're like, oh, you. Okay.
That's good.
But yeah, eventually I just was so persistent.
I love it. Mademoiselle Bellow. And
Yeah.
then it became Madame Bellow.
Yeah,
no
yeah,
doubt.
right, exactly. Yeah.
Anyways, are there
Any other questions?
Any other questions or comments? This was so fun.
It was.
Yeah. So here it is. It's really pretty.
Yeah, you can come and look at it. Yeah.
It's just there's a lot in
It's
here.
heavy.
Yeah.
And
it's really great. So thank you so much, Juliet,
Thank you for being such a
bringing
good
this into
listener.
the world. Really wonderful.